Just like to talk a little bit about cognitions and their hierarchy and interrelationship. Now, this is a presentation for the head of faculty group at my school, and I guess if you've made it this far, you have some interest in it as well. So some assumptions, hopefully safe assumptions that I'll be making, is that we've always thought that students demonstrate processes with subject matter, always, since the dawn of time, essentially, in terms of education anyway. We identify and explicitly teach necessary processes that students will encounter in assessment tasks and learning experiences in general, of course. We model and use exemplars of processes in assisting students to understand and critique both process and product. And we then measure the success as to how they've been met through students' products using standards or criteria. So with that as a basis, I guess moving into cognitions. So in the current sort of climate of the new QCE system and the new syllabus suite, cognitions are really at the forefront. Now is a time for consistency, of course, of the definition and the basic processes, but I guess I'd just caution of cognition panic. They're not new. They've always been there. We've always worked at developing the cognitions of our students. So we're looking at familiarity and not overload. I'd be quite wary of essentially building lessons around cognitions. They should be part of the natural way you would work with subject matter and not necessarily focused on in isolation at all. They're foundational to teaching and learning. They enliven the subject matter. So what you do with the subject matter in terms of the level of thinking you apply to it, so they drive our teaching. We should see them in learning, hopefully. Something I've said quite often, and I borrow this from a great man, Keith Swanwick, and that is teach music musically, teach maths mathematically, teach whatever subject whateverly. We are talking about following the natural ways of thinking and knowing in your subject. And I guess if you're straying from doing that, you're probably not really teaching your subject. So that's just something to be mindful of. If you're teaching music, we're teaching musical processes that should feel relatively natural in terms of us thinking and knowing in and of our subject. So I've been doing a bit of thinking about cognitions, and we've had a lot of professional development at school on this, and that I guess comes, that sort of drew me to the cognition panic comment before, that we're focusing on one cognition in isolation. We're looking at all these different components of that cognition, but life isn't that compartmentalized. And I know for the purposes of PD, there was a reason it went that way, but cognitions are interrelated. And some cognitions enable others. We don't often use them in isolation at all. So if we're looking at a discipline of thinking or a complete process or a task, together they provide the entire picture, or they frame a discipline of thinking, process or task. As I mentioned, they're hierarchical, yet they're very intertwined. There are rarely neat edges to them, and they don't always stack on top of each other so easily. So there is a natural lower to higher order staging, I guess, of these. But it's not always to say that we started at a particular place at any particular time. There's a whole range of variables as to why we might or might not do that. And that's what I'm getting into here. Do we always start with the retrieval and comprehension, lower order cognitions? I'm not so convinced we always do. Depends on our level of skill and level of knowledge, what we're actually doing with the task, any framing that's been provided, the question itself. And can we know before we know? And I think in music, we definitely can. We can know something intuitively before we know labels. So we might have a rather high sort of process, I guess, of cognition that we could apply to something, but without the understanding of what it is we're exactly doing below. Now, that might just be a fairly musical or arts-based sort of practice example, where we're going back in and filling these analytical sort of ways of knowing a subject. But I do think we can know before we know. Sometimes we just know intuitively about subject matter and processes, but we need to make sure that we're making them conscious in students. So on that note too, the jigsaw analogy, so all pieces making the picture. So is the frame important? That's what I'm getting at with the comment above, that we don't always need to start at the lower end. We might need some kind of frame to start. So we might start up in the realm of higher order things like evaluation, like what is the criteria that I need to use here? And that's not in evaluation in itself, but it's definitely part of evaluation that we sort of start with before we go down into lower order things like retrieval and comprehension processes as well. So the frame can be very, very important sometimes. And as I've mentioned, there are significant interrelationships between cognitions in how the task is framed. So I thought I'd just step you through these 3 documents, principally focused on the last one under 2019. The first 2 for the purposes of showing you that cognitions have always been there and that they have been considered in this context of musicological investigation anyway. They've always been there, underpinning the way we talk about music, our task construction, and the way it's assessed essentially. So there's quite a little bit to zoom through here. The first, this is back in 2015, the Musicology analysis template. And if we have a look at the top here, perceive and interpret, analyse and evaluate, synthesise and justify are cognitions essentially. And they've been put in that order of essentially of lower to higher order there. As we move through, we can see how they align to the task itself. You can see some other questions that help enable that and break down and clarify that language for students. And you might also notice that they are the interrelationship. So as you work from left to right, we're generally stepping up through the lower to higher order cognitions, but not always. So that example I gave before of evaluate is actually quite prominent in this example here. So we frame something up, we then perceive and interpret what we think is important, dissect and examine, and then measure back up, assign merit according to that criteria we established initially. That was a really complex sheet for the kids to work through. So I persisted on that for almost 2 years before I then changed to this. So we're talking the 2013 music syllabus here. We have the same cognitions there. And I was talking about cognitive processes here before it became a language of this syllabus, just through the syllabus experiences I've had with the new one. So I guess that's probably got me a little bit of a leg up on this, but we can see those staged cognitions there and how they are aligned to the task as well. And again, the supportive questioning down the side. It was a very cyclical process stepping through that. So look, I don't want to spend any time focusing on that. That was just purely for the example of cognitions embedded in learning experiences, assessment tasks, and how they are realised in scaffolding assessment. So the latest iteration, the 2019 version, which aligns with the new music syllabus, uses the cognitive toolkit from the QCAA and its definitions of the cognitions and the processes. And they've been refined and contextualised to 2 tasks in music. So the music people out there think of the musicology dimension or objective, which no longer really exists, but the components of that we will see in the project. So a musicological investigation that informs something that is made, and the examination is 2 distinct tasks that draw on the same cognitions in whole or in part. So what you're about to see is for both me and my students. It is unpacked, and currently the year 11s are only explaining and applying literacy skills essentially, but they'll gradually sort of move through that. So if you can just consider that they're looking at this blue band first up, that's where they're starting. We're not jumping into the whole thing at one time. So here's the flowchart, and here are the 5 cognitions that underpin the project and the examination. We have explain, analyse, apply is apply literacy skills, evaluate and justify. So if we step through those, we have explain in the context of music. We present descriptions and reveal relevant facts of the use of music elements and concepts to communicate meaning. When we analyse, we examine and consider the constituent parts and relationship between music elements, concepts and stylistic characteristics. When we evaluate, we make judgments about the ideas and concepts evident in music in relation to purpose and context, and you can finish the rest off there. You'll notice that these are also in this form in student language, so you give valid reasons to support, or when you kind of thing. So really trying to support the students' understanding of what this definition is. And you may have also noticed the questions in italics underneath as well. So just an effort to assist clarify. Applied across all of this, of course, is the literacy component. So when you apply, you select, apply literacy skills, you select appropriate languages, so on and so forth, to basically to communicate the meaning. So that's essentially where we're starting from, with our 5 cognitions that are there, colour-coded from blue down through to green, with the grey apply at the side. And we're also looking at the stages of the task, so pre-task considerations. I'm sure there are better ways of articulating this. When we're constructing the response in the response construction, and the resolution of the task and final copy, essentially. So where are we going to start? I think, what is the question asking first, and also what will frame and organise my argument. So they're pre-task considerations that are based on analysis and evaluation. So determining the reason for analysis, and if I have my reason, what's the purpose and the criteria for this analysis to deem whether it's essentially valid or not. So that's essentially where I'm encouraging my students to start. Now that's really stacked upon the question and how the question's posed to students. And if there is a question that actually genuinely gets them to construct a viewpoint that is based on the analysis and evaluation, and the use of evaluation to support the findings in terms of criteria from analysis, and that's probably a really good place to start. So there's quite a bit going on in that little space there, but what is the question asking, and what will I use to frame or organise my argument? So we sort of step through these processes in the grey box, considering those together, and then down into the evaluate, examining the music ideas within the work and determining the possible merit value of the ideas, is where we start before we do anything like explain, which is where we're going to now, the lower order cognition. So once you've got that, what's important here to look at? Identify the music ideas and concepts that are connected to these claims you want to make. They may or may not be well connected. If not, potentially discard or look for new ones. But what is something I always say to my students is that what's important here to look at? What is really do you need to examine and look here to support your what the question, your response, your viewpoint to what the question is asking. So we move through explain, determining the parts, some music elements in this case, sequencing them into some kind of order or grouping. That can be quite a challenge sometimes, and writing some kind of preliminary explanation there as well. We then take that information into analysis. So we've identified these constituent parts, and we're looking for meanings and relationships and patterns and similarities and differences in there before we determine the reasonableness of those things. So we can sort of cycle around in that diagram and that space a little bit. We are deconstructing, we're looking at the parts that make the whole, I guess, there, and determining, are they suitable to take into this space here? So determine the merit value significance of the analysed parts. So you hold your analysed parts up to these criteria that you've established back at the start. I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. If there's no match, off we go back to the start, which is going to happen now. So we go back. What is the purpose? What will frame and organise my argument? And what are some possible merit value ideas of the work? In a musical context, if it's not sort of working there, we need to go back and reframe and generate a new theme, essentially. So I like to talk about themes a lot. What's going to support your theme? If we've made it all the way through to here again, and there is a match with the criteria we propose in terms of evaluation. So we've looked at the merit of the value, significance of the analysed parts, and they do support what we're trying to say. Then we appraise the strength and limitations of that in relation to the criteria. And then we organise that evidence to support that criteria as we start to justify. In the final copy, I guess we're consolidating and checking that our explanation, that lower level, so our when we're talking about music elements and concepts and revealing facts about them, that we're saying things that make sense and that they enhance the audience's understanding. We ensure that our reason is supported in our analytical offerings, and we review the evaluation to ensure there's a match with the criteria. And we write the justification explaining how the evidence supports the argument before we review. So everything in that grey box there is essentially looking at clarity of the argument as well. So there's an awful lot that I've just stepped through there, but it's one way of me sort of showing, I guess, the entangled nature of these cognitive processes or cognitions. And I like the idea that we need a bit of a frame before we start on the lower order cognitions. Now, often that frame is provided by the task, but a really good, authentic task that allows students to establish their own viewpoint and establish their own criteria to examine the musical work and the value of the ideas within it and measure it up against those criteria is really quite powerful. Before we sort of delve back through, explain, so preventing descriptions of what's there, analyse when we look at the parts and the relationships, the evaluation when we essentially measure up the so what, are the parts important, do they advance my argument and how they connect to the criteria, and then the organisation and justification of the argument in terms of supporting a viewpoint. So as I said, there's quite a lot in there. So very happy to field any questions or continue the discussion in any way, shape or form. I realise this is a very, very quick step through. It's certainly not in its final form, but it's something that I'd like to really continue to explore and develop. In saying that working with cognitions isn't a linear process, I'm very aware that I've essentially mapped out a fairly linear process, but it's not as easy as that. There's a lot of cycling around. And I guess as we, in a musical context anyway, look at things like explain, look at things like analyse, we're looking at different elements and features. So potentially we're looking around that explain, analyse sort of flow chart. There's a lot more back and forth in there that the diagram alludes to. So anyway, that's a very short, sharp presentation I just thought I'd share very quickly with you. I need to keep this to about 20 minutes with questions, so it looks like I've done pretty well here. But I hope you get some value out of that, and it stokes your thinking about the cognitions in your subject area and how they actually interrelate and how you're actually going to deal with teaching these to students without the overload and the panic. What's being presented here is hopefully as close as music analysis can get to feeling like a natural process. Hopefully it's a natural process. So we start with explaining, framing up what we're looking for, explaining what's there, pulling it apart, saying, is this a value? That's the evaluation section, and justifying support with evidence from across the score or the music or whatever, before taking it back through those processes for checking in the final copy. It should be a value for you, hopefully. And I'd love to hear from anyone who has any comments or feedback on that, and look forward to continuing to develop this resource for my students and also for myself. So please feel free to get in contact, and all the best as you embark on working with kids in your schools. It's the best thing. Enjoy.